Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's today, Tuesday, the 27th of March, 2018, and I'm going to speak with Gilbert Doctorow. He is an American independent political analyst and geopolitical expert. He is based in Brussels. His latest book is titled, Does the United States Have a Future? And he was recently a member of the International Observer Mission to the Russian presidential elections on the Crimea. Mr. Doctorow, you are in Brussels right now. In a report afterwards, you stated the event was of historic importance. Why is that?
Well, the entire election was important because Vladimir Putin achieved a level of voter support that was unrivaled in the past and was quite astonishing to many outside observers. But in my own case, I had a privilege of going to Crimea, which had a double importance. In Crimea, the joining, the reunification, as they call it there, or the annexation, as Russian detractors tend to call it here in the West, back in 2014, was the consequence of a referendum that was held in the days just before the 18th of March. The 18th of March, 2014, was the day that the Crimean Peninsula entered the Russian Federation as two component entities, the naval port of Sevastopol and the Crimea proper with its capital in Simferopol. That referendum had been questioned by many in the international community as coming at a time when there were widespread disturbances in Crimea, when there were pro and anti-Russian demonstrations, and when there were, as we are told, Russian soldiers in the streets. This suggests a kind of intimidation or an unnatural atmosphere which could explain the outcome and which could be denied as valid by the United States, by the EU and others who did not want, for political reasons, to recognize that unification with Russia. What we had now in 2018, on the very same anniversary day of March 18th, was informally a second referendum. It was, of course, the presidential election, but it gave the whole population of Crimea an opportunity to demonstrate, as they did finally, that in time of peace, with no soldiers on the streets, with no manifestations, demonstrations of any kind going on, they would vote as their hearts told them, and as they did, which was in a turnout of voters approximately the same as in the rest of Russia. About 67% of eligible voters came to the ballot box. They had a vote for Vladimir Putin that was at 92%. I would just remind the listeners that in Russia, the rest of Russia, the average support for Vladimir Putin was already quite remarkable. It was 77%. So in many respects, this was an extraordinary day in Crimea and, of course, an historic event for Russia as a whole.
President Putin won with 77% of the votes, with a 67% turnout, which is important also, because the turnout was 12% higher than the turnout in 2012 when Obama was re-elected, if you want to put it in a certain perspective. So on the Crimea, you said it was 92% voted versus the national average of approximately 77%. So in this way, it's 40% more than the votes which went to Obama during this re-election. Did you have the idea that people were forced to vote on the Crimea? And first of all, perhaps it's important to know also, do you speak Russian?
Yes, I do speak Russian fluently. The delegation was not a delegation of Russian speakers. It was a delegation coming from 20 different countries, in which, let's say, we were a total of 43 observers, but we were split into two groups. And I only saw the ones who were with me and who were in the Simferopol, the Crimea proper part of the peninsula. The second delegation, with approximately the same number of observers, went to the port city of Sevastopol. We did not meet. We had separate press conferences. We saw different districts, obviously. But I can say that for our group, we had several chaperones who were there from the Russian side, from the Crimean side, that is, to help those of us, which is the large majority of the observers, who were not fluent in Russian, or who don't know Russian at all. There were 1/4 of us, myself included, who are good Russian speakers, and we helped out as we could with our fellow observers. So there was no language problem. What I would like to call out is what were we trying to do by this mission? How many voting districts did we visit, and how much time did we spend at each one? In point of fact, this was a very full day for the observer delegation. And we consisted of a very mixed body of people. Some of us were, like myself, either academics or professional analysts working with think tanks in various countries of Europe, and not only Europe. We had, in our group, there was a representative of the president of Pakistan, there was a representative of the president of Malaysia. But there were also a substantial number of people's representatives, that is to say, national deputies from the EU member states, and also a couple of members of the European Parliament. So these are people with considerable experience in elections. They have passed through elections themselves, and they knew very well what they were looking for. I will say, in answer to your question about what could have gone on, what could have caught our attention, and what we would have certainly reported back had we seen it. The idea of a falsified vote is something that we know went on in Russia in the 2011 Duma elections. And one of the examples of that type of abuse was the shipping in to the voting centers of groups. That is to say that either they were civil servants who were shepherded to vote by their senior officials, or they were company employees who were sent in by buses by their employers to ensure that the right vote was entered into the ballot box. What we saw in our visit to 10 different voting areas were a very normal flow of people, ones and twos, couples, some young families, who came, went to the desks with their documents, with their passports, to be recorded, to be checked off against the voter registration lists. They received their voting slip, went into the cabins, drew the curtain, cast their preference by a check mark on one of the 8 candidates, and then went to the ballot boxes, which were either manual, that is, you slip a folded vote into a plexiglass voting box, which was sealed, or they were, as it happened in half of the areas we visited, you would cast your vote by the new electronic means, in which the plexiglass voting box was covered by a sealed scanner, electronic scanner, which was autonomous. That is to say, it is not online, it is not plugged into the electrical circuit, and so it is insulated from any possibility of tampering or interference from outside. This device, very simple in its appearance, was a self-feeding scanner. That is to say, you just touch the entry slit to the scanner. It would take the ballot, read the ballot, record it electronically, and then deposit it into the ballot box below. This was a quite remarkable and I think quite simple and technically elegant solution to voting that many countries in the world would do well to adopt. It is fast as an electronic voting mechanism is, but it was secure as a paper manual ballot voting system is. That is to say, should there be any discrepancy or any challenge to the votes, the paper trail, the original paper ballots, remain in every sealed voting box. So this was a technical achievement, a considerable moment, which we were able to observe. The flow of voters, there were no groups coming to vote. There were no lines in any of the 10 voting polling stations that we visited. We spent close to 45 minutes at each of these polling stations. We spoke in every case first to the senior electoral official. These are all volunteers, by the way. And then we were let loose. We could speak to any of the observers from the public observer teams, of which there were across Russia 150,000 volunteers. So that every polling station in Russia had several of these representatives of the local community who sat there and make sure that if there were any scandals, they would record that, they would complain to the Central Electoral Commission.
So
in our case,
did...
we also were told that passing through in some of these stations would be representatives of one or more of the candidates.
So you didn't have the impression that you were either being manipulated or that the whole system was undemocratic?
Well, let me be very frank about this. The elections in Russia were taking place against a background of considerable information warfare. This propaganda to and fro from both sides, from Russia and from the United States and the European Union and other countries, has developed to an intensity unrivaled since the worst days of the Cold War. And to pretend that this information war would not find some expression on election day would be naive or unrealistic. The question is who constituted these missions of electoral observers. And I've seen criticism in the case of our visit to Crimea. Of course, Ukraine doesn't recognize the legitimacy of these votes. Ukraine continues to insist that Crimea is a territory of its own, and therefore Ukraine was quite interested in discrediting the electoral mission to Crimea, of which I was a member. The reality is that all of the electoral observers came upon invitation from the Central Electoral Commission in Moscow. These members were receiving accreditation from the Electoral Commission. They were nominated by a variety of different host organizations. Some of them were Russian NGOs. In my case, that was true. It was an organization that dates from before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I believe it's the Russian Peace Foundation. But other members of the observer missions were coming from the European Union Parliament or from national parliaments, and they had received invitations from the State Duma. Now, in the case of the European Union, the parliament here, the Russian Duma extended invitations to the entire European Parliament. So there's no question of the Russian intent having been to select or to screen who would be coming to ensure that they would get the report that they wanted. Nothing of the sort. The single largest contingent in the electoral mission, and there were a total of 1,500 foreign observers accredited to the Russian elections. The single largest contingent came from the OSCE, and that was 580 observers out of 1,500. That's considerable. There again, the people who actually came were from among those whom the Russians invited. The Russians invited almost everybody. Who actually came was the result of self-selection. The major centrist parties of Europe, for example, chose not to come. The center-right parties, the center-left parties chose not to come as electoral observers. That is because they did not want to witness what they knew would be results that they didn't want, the overwhelming election of Vladimir Putin. They are, by predisposition, anti-Putin and anti-Russian, and so they self-elected not to come. Therefore, by definition, the large majority of those people who came to be electoral observers were ranged from neutral on Russia to very pro-Russian. I do not deny the presence in my own group of several people, I would say 10% of our group, that was very pro-Russian and propagandistic-minded. That is indisputable, but it is also unfair to take those several individuals as being representative of the large, quite neutral and quite open-minded and quite critical fellow electoral observers.
Still, the media denounced the process as fake because of the near certainty of the outcome, the re-election of Vladimir Putin, you wrote. Why is this? Why is the mainstream media so biased from the beginning? I mean, also Chancellor Angela Merkel, for instance, has been chosen, re-elected 4 times, just like Putin. So Time magazine even named her the Person of the Year in 2015. So what exactly is going on?
Well, Russia is a special case, and I think that the listeners have to appreciate that if you take a case like Germany, Germany is a perfect vassal. It works within a scenario that is staged in Washington, D.C. When the United States says jump, Germany jumps. When the United States says bark, Germany barks. Now, that is not a criticism of Germany as such. It is true of nearly all of the EU. Very sad, but that is the reality. In the case of Russia, Russia does not bark and Russia does not jump at Washington's bidding. On the contrary. And particularly in his March 1st speech, to this kind of state of the state speech, or the Russians call it the address of the president to the Federal Assembly, the 2 houses of parliament, Vladimir Putin spelled out very clearly that Russia has reassumed its equal status with the United States as the world's most powerful nuclear powers, and as states having parity. Russia has assumed a greater self-confidence in looking after its own interests and interests of its people, and not being subservient to the U.S. hegemony. Now that is a policy decision that the Kremlin has taken at its own cost and with considerable risk. One of those risks has been the United States' attempt at every turn to undo the regime, what they call a regime, what normal people would call the government of Vladimir Putin and the Russian people, and to foment a regime change that would bring in people who will listen and take orders from Washington the way that Boris Yeltsin did in what Washington sees as the good old days of Russian democracy in the 1990s, and what Russians today see as an unmitigated disaster for their nation.
So why would the so-called free press adjust itself completely to the wishes of the powers that be in the Western world? Why would they, let's say you hear and then you get somebody who is opposed to what is said. We always had in Western journalism this idea that you ask all parties their side. But this has completely been abandoned right now. Why is this?
Well, the crisis in journalism goes much far further than the coverage of Russian affairs. I think we're all aware that the technological changes that have taken place in the last 20 years, the introduction of the internet and the removal of intermediaries in many functions of business and also in exchange of ideas and communications, the direct contact, which is very fine and admirable in spreading news, has come at the expense of the traditional purveyors of news who are economically hit. And the whole profession of journalism has been substantially weakened financially by these changes in technology that are undeniable. One of the results of that is that a weakened journalism has become ever more dependent on ingratiating itself to the powers that be and to find what small privileges it can as the acting as the loudspeakers of government policies. That is where we are today. A great many journalists are receiving miserable compensation, if any. The internet age is an age of happy volunteers and very unhappy wage earners. And so the fact that journalism would today not attract the strongest minds or the most independent spirits is sadly understandable and is where we are.
But it gets an absurd aspect, because I'll give you a few examples. More than 8% of the Dutch households live under the poverty line. The poverty rate in the United States was in 2016 around 14%. In 2013, at least 1.6 million US households fell under the $2 a day per person threshold. Those households included 3.5 million children and accounted for 4.3% of the non-elderly households with children. Does this show the full respect for people's rights between elections, as the OSCE has said against the Russians? They said, well, this is not real democracy because you do not respect the full respect for people's rights between elections. We don't respect that either in the Western world. So where does this absurdity come from? I mean, you can be a propagandist, but at a certain time you are going to realize yourself that you're totally becoming absurd.
Well, unfortunately, hypocrisy has always been the coin of the realm in politics. So it's not a new illness. It's implicit in the political profession. The question, as you say, is when does this hypocrisy come or play out against the background of domestic poverty and of failed policies domestically? The thing that has always surprised me is that journalists who are most keen to call out the failures of Russian policy, of the Russian economy, and so forth, many of which, or much of which, they are finding in the Russian press. That is to say, these journalists who are based in Moscow and who are reporting to the New York Times or to Western newspapers, much of their discovery is not by their own investigative work. It's coming by reading Russian newspapers because Russians themselves are concerned about failures in their society. Well, these people who are doing a magnificent job of calling out and filling the front pages of our newspapers with the glaring problems or challenges of democratizing Russia, they never look in the mirror. They never consider that many of the same failures exist back home. And so it is a kind of paranoia here, a kind of split mind, a schizophrenia, where Russian failures are obvious, your own failures are hidden or simply not talked about. That's sad, but that's the reality.
How long do you think a system like that can legitimize itself? Because if, at one side we see that many Russians voted for Putin, and in the other side you see in the United States especially the conflict between the so-called populists and the other side the liberal, so-called liberal urban elites. So how long do these two, this conflict, which is within the Western world, how long can it go on, do you think?
Well, we keep on coming up to the abyss. We keep on approaching a point there where everyone has to sober up or fall off the cliff. And so far, I would say that the West European and the United States leaderships have understood the seriousness of Russia's challenge among themselves, or some of them among themselves, while not sharing in any way their concern about the limitations of their power with respect to Russia, without sharing that with the broader population. And so we see a succession of diversionary activities. Like in the last few weeks, this whole Skripal nerve gas poisoning, where the public is being fed daily a hysterical account of Russian threat, which is a manufactured and completely fake threat, whereas the strategic threat that Russia genuinely poses to the pretended world hegemony of the United States is not talked about at all. So these phony threats are filling our newspapers, and the real threat is kept hidden. Nonetheless, I am firmly convinced that at some point in the not too distant future, as Mr. Trump said a week ago about his intentions, at some time in the not too remote future, he will meet with Mr. Putin, and they will start to talk seriously about arms control. So the attempt to cover up realities by creating a convenient bugbear of Russia will fall by the wayside. We'll see. But if I'm wrong, and if these talks do not take place, then we are now on a smooth course to World War III.
Let's still talk little bit more about the Western world. 42 people in the world hold the same wealth as 3.7 billion of the poorest. This is the product of a neoliberal system, which has been the main ideology of the Western world since the end of the 70s in the last century. There is an issue of applying double standards and expecting that we can handle these double standards and use them politically. What I notice is that you can use them in the Western world, but the rest of the world, which is the majority, they don't fall for this propaganda because they see on a daily basis what the reality is. So if, for instance, Europe or the people of the United States want to improve their own situation, they have to stop one way or another listening to all this propaganda. Don't you agree with this? Or do you think, no, they don't have to because whatever?
I will skip for a second the very important issue that you raised about the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. I'd like to go to the second part of your question. That is, do the people buy it? Are the people brainwashed? In the States, I'm afraid that's true. I'm very much afraid that the daily feed of propaganda has found willing acceptance in the very broad population. All right. Still, Mr. Trump won his election barely, though not with a popular vote, in 2016, while speaking part of the time about how we have to have normal relations with Russia. So in the case of one part of his program, obviously the public was not concerned enough to turn away from him and vote for Hillary Clinton on the question of dealings with Russia. Here in Europe, it's a quite different situation. I don't believe that, at least I will talk about Belgium, because that's what I see around me. I don't believe that the Belgian population, the people in the street, except for a minute, any of the propaganda they find in their newspapers about Russia. And if they follow Euronews is a bit equivocal about Russia. One day, Euronews is speaking of Russia in a malicious way, and the next day they're dealing with Russia as if it's another member of the European team. So there you have conflicting signals. But when I came back from my mission to Crimea and just shared with my post delivery man, or shared with the neighbor down the street 50 meters from my house who runs a small greengrocer's shop, that I had been to Russia on an electoral mission, both of them unequivocally and without an instant's hesitation said, "Oh yeah, Putin, good guy, good guy." The taxi driver coming in from the airport, "Oh, Putin's a good guy." And it's not just Mr. Everyman in the street. I think quite significantly of an event that happened at the start of this year. It was in the second week of January, when the most prestigious gentlemen's club, French-speaking gentlemen's club in Brussels, held for the first time ever a dinner, a soiree, to which the wives and women friends were invited as well, on the motif of Russian Christmas. Actually, it was closer to Russian New Year, but that's neither here nor there. It was to celebrate Russian Christmas, and so they had, this is a very fine French cuisine club, which had for that evening Russian cuisine, which had a group of Cossack balalaika players and singers perform. And it was the Belgian aristocracy. There was Baron this and Baroness that, who were sitting comfortably in the lounge chairs before we went to dinner and exchanging chit-chat. And I can tell you that the mood at this evening of the social elite of Brussels was quite pro-Russian, and not the least bit sympathetic to the Belgian government's policies towards Russia, not to mention the EU policies. For that reason, I'd say there's a very big break here between the people and the political classes. Even as I say, the social classes, the top society here in Brussels is more pro-Russian than anti-Russian. And every single seat in that dinner was sold out. So I can't explain immediately why Europeans would be less conformist than Americans, but that seems to be the case, and so I'm not too concerned about the mental balance of the people I see around me here in Europe.
How do you explain, because in your report you explained the reasons for the popularity in Russia of Putin himself, the popularity after 18 years in power. What are the main factors which play in this popularity?
To put it back in an American vernacular of Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. Mr. Putin has done wonders for the Russian economy. The gross domestic product has risen several times in those 18 years. The average take-home pay, which is not a notional figure, but a figure that actually people receive each month in their bank accounts, or because from when he took office, wages, whatever nominal, were not paid. Now they are paid, and they're 10 times higher than they were when he first took office. These are figures which people notice. The general feeling of well-being and of a future for individuals and for the country at large, has created very measurable results. The first one that comes to mind is the life expectancy. Life expectancy in general in the year 2000 in Russia was 60. For males, it was 57. Today, life expectancy in Russia is 72, and they are doing what they can in the next 5 years to take it to 78, which will put Russia pretty much on a par with the most advanced societies on Earth. Now, that isn't just a medical happening, it's an expression of will to live, because men in particular were dying by the easy suicide, by smoking and drinking themselves to death, because there was such a depression and such a depressive feeling about themselves, since they couldn't support their families anymore. I'm speaking about middle-class people who were bankrupted, who were turned to poverty and to bear survival poverty during the economic reforms of the 1990s. Well, Vladimir Putin has turned that around. We also have the issue of the birth rate and the abortion rate, which have gone in opposite directions. The Russian society has become a family-centered society. Now, this is hard to take for many people in Western Europe, where various minorities, including sexual preference minorities, have been put up on a pedestal as a mark of achievement of our liberal society. Russia has been looking for a different mark of achievement, which is to reestablish its demographic facts, which were very adverse as a result of 10 years of horrible depression. Now, Vladimir Putin has done all of that, but he's done something for people's pride in their country and identity of their country. The reunification with Crimea was a sea change in Russian feeling about themselves. It also had an impact on how they felt about their government. There was a lot of talk about corruption in Russia and the crooks who were enriching themselves in the entourage of Vladimir Putin. That was before 2014. When the unification with Crimea was a reality and the West imposed sanctions on Russia, the broad Russian population understood that the whole country was in the same boat, including the wealthiest people in the land, who were accused up to that point of enriching themselves at the public expense. So the people began to take a slightly different view and a more open view of who was doing what for them in the top layers of the Russian politics. The result after the Crimean reunification was Russia's entry into the war in Syria on the side of Assad and against the Islamic State. For many Russians, that was a test of the country's new military. The military institutions had fallen on very bad times from the 1990s, and they were unequipped. There were many abuses in the training. It was still largely, if not entirely, a conscription army, and it lacked professionalism. What they saw very quickly in the Russian activity in Syria was a highly professional, highly technological force, largely a volunteer and long-term service force, which had very few casualties as a result of the high technology weapons they were using, and which were very efficient and very determined to do what the United States and its allies, including the NATO allies, were unable or unwilling to do in the couple of years before Russia entered the war on the Islamic State. That is to say, to brutally decimate these barbaric fighters who had been carrying out and who had put online their horrible crimes against civilians and against their political enemies. The Russians took great pride in the professionalism of their military force in Syria. So in this, then the culmination of this process was what Vladimir Putin unveiled in his March 1st speech, where he showed what kind of investments and with what success Russia had developed strategic and high-tech delivery systems for nuclear and for conventional weapons with global reach, and how they had, as they explained after the speech, essentially turned the investment by the United States of several $100 billion in installations in what is called a global anti-ballistic missile system, but is actually a system to contain Russia and potentially give the United States a first strike capability against Russia. They had turned this whole system into a new Maginot Line. That's to say, into a completely useless expense, which provides no strategic advantage to the United States against Russia, and which is unable to dissuade Russia by the possibility of exercising a first nuclear strike. So these various components did a great deal to explain Vladimir Putin's dramatic and unparalleled electoral victory on the 18th of March.
Let me ask you something in a different, on a different subject. The nerve agent Novichok, this whole thing around it, the British analysis only indicated, so didn't prove, but only indicated the substance used to poison Mr. Skripal and his daughter Julia. This indication, again, no proof, this indication could not positively identify whether the substance was part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok, or whether it was closely related to this Novichok. Nevertheless, Mrs. May's statement claims positive identification of a military-grade nerve agent of the Novichok class of chemical weapons. British evidence to the High Court shows at the same time that no such positive identification took place. So what you could detect from this as a neutral journalist like me is that they are trying to build a case which they don't have. Now this trying to build a case against Russia, what is the explanation for this? Is there another explanation than that they want to break up Russia, as the Kissinger said in 2015, or is that something else which I overlook? What do you think?
Well, I'm not a military expert, and least of all am I an expert in chemical weapons. But I don't make any apologies for what I'm about to say, because all of these particular points in the Skripal case, I consider them like flies. And I don't think it makes much sense for us to go after flies with a baseball bat. It's missing the point. This, I think we have to recall that going back to late December, early January, the Russians were quite alarmed that the United States was preparing, ahead of their presidential elections in March, some kind of dirty trick, some kind of foul, fake false flag, some kind of operation that could be very damaging to Russia there, and which could justify imposing sanctions that would lead us straight to war. In particular, I think of people like Hermann Greff, the president or chairman of Sberbank, the country's largest bank, and for that matter, Europe's largest bank. When he gave an interview to the Financial Times in the days just before Christmas, in which he issued an open warning to the West not to do something like cut Russia off from SWIFT, because the response would be quick and would be devastating, suggesting that at a certain point, economic sanctions justify military response. Now, that was going back to December. Of course, people have very short memories. In the couple of weeks before the elections in March, a number of things happened. One of them was that the United States moved its strike fleet in the Mediterranean to within launch range for cruise missile launch attack on Damascus. The Russians at that point, this is going back 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, the Russians at this point said openly that they were aware of plans which were designed in Washington and were being implemented by the white casks, those lovely people whom we find on Euronews and BBC, and others on the ground in Syria among the rebel or jihadist groups that the United States backs. Their plans were to create a chemical attack on the civilian population, possibly in eastern Ghouta, which they would then blame on the Assad regime and would use to justify a US missile attack on Damascus, whether to take out, that is, murder Assad, or to create some other havoc in the capital. The Russian generals said in plain language that they would consider any attack on Damascus to justify their counterattack against the incoming missiles or planes, and on anything that launched those missiles or planes. What you have here is a direct Russian threat to blow the US Navy out of the water, which they have the full firepower to do. The end result is we heard no more about chemical attacks in Syria. Instead, we have a controlled environment nerve gas attack in Salisbury. If I had to choose between the two and say which of these false flag operations would be safer for the world at large, I would take the Salisbury Skripal case, which is the way things actually went. So, considering what risks we all faced of a US engineered scandal to justify an attack humiliating the Russians, I think we've come out of this quite well. The fact is that the Skripal case had nothing to do with Russia or Russians. It had to do with American and West European displeasure with the outcome of the Russian elections. So I won't go after the particulars in what was the posture of Mr. Skripal when he and his daughter were found on a bench, or how far away is that from the nearest British chemical weapons factory, about 12 miles. These facts we can amuse ourselves with, but they're missing the big picture. The big picture was the determination of the United States and its allies to create a scandal that could justify some ratcheting up of punishment. Now, along the same line of reasoning, I became aware today of some information coming out of Israel, namely the suggestion that this expulsion of Russian diplomats that's coordinated between the United States and 15 European countries has another context. which is for the United States to take in hand and resume its leadership, in quotation marks, of the NATO countries, to prepare them for a common front on Iran, and for the United States' cancellation of the Iran nuclear deal. We'll see in the coming days how that plays out, but it also has a logic. And both of these logics, there's a Russian, to punish Russia for the way it voted on the 18th of March, and or to prepare the way for a United States move against the Iran nuclear deal. In all of these cases, Russia is abused to serve other purposes, having nothing whatever to do with Russia.
Still, the Europeans are following this line of politics, and in which the NATO is more a threat, as you concluded in your report, in your book. The NATO is more a threat than it makes us safe in Europe. And that will be my final question. How unsafe is NATO?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because I'd like to put it into a slightly different historical context. I live here in Brussels, and so I've been aware of the changing heads of NATO, going back to people like Lord Carrington, who were very distinguished gentlemen, I think, in the good sense of the British social tradition. They were well educated, they were jovial, they were good bar companions, or actually, considering their social status, they were good companions at the bar of a high-ranking social club. They were good people to invite to ladies' clubs to deliver a luncheon speech. That was the past, and that past was locked into time when the head of NATO had really nothing to do, because all decisions on security were being taken in Washington and in Moscow. And Europe was all taken over the head of Europe. After the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States became the world's only superpower, the notion of negotiating things over the head of Europe was replaced by a gesture of equality in decision-making and importance to the NATO structure as it exists here in Europe. And we found different people appointed to be the heads of NATO. They didn't have the social grace of a Lord Carrington. They didn't come and speak to women's social clubs for lunch. They were very busy plotting how to destroy Afghanistan and how to do other nice things. I think that there is a chance now, if the United States really re-enters into negotiations with Russia on arms limitation, if the generals understand well the message that Vladimir Putin gave them on March 1st, that Russia is fully at parity in strategic strength with the United States, I think we will see a reversion to NATO's role as it was before 1992. I think we'll see that strategic questions are no longer delegated down to Brussels. They are held in a tight fist in Washington, and that Washington is once again dealing with Moscow over the most important strategic questions of the world, and that Europe is out of the loop. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That is a question for your listeners to consider. But I'm explaining what is likely to come.
Thank you, Gilbert Doctorow, and till the next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Stan.